Welcome to the Beyond Data podcast. I'm Rhett Talbot, and this is the Follow-Up Friday episode for October 27th. We are following up today on episode 1 of the podcast, which released last week and focused on the oyster toadfish. I'm your host, Rhett Talbot, and unfortunately the special guest, which I had planned for this episode of the Follow-Up Friday podcast, was unable to join us. So we have another special guest who's pinch hitting today, and that's Karen Talbot. Welcome, Karen.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, in full disclosure, Karen is my wife, but she's also a fisheries expert in her own right. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about your connection to fisheries, Karen.
Well, I work primarily as a scientific illustrator, and my area of expertise is fishes. So I do some illustrations for museums and textbooks and magazines, but I also do some work for private clients, and not just fishes, but that's my specialization, and most of my work involves fishes.
And in addition to Karen, we also have Moby. Moby's the great white kitten, and we're actually sitting, just to set the scene for you, we're sitting in our living room, and Moby's lying on the floor on his back, and you're probably going to hear him at some point during the episode. And also our other cat, Didion, is in the other room, and she may join us as well. As we like to do on Follow-Up Friday episodes, it's a more relaxed, casual, looser format than the deep dive that we do once a month in our regular episodes. And so we're going to be enjoying a couple beers while we are having the conversation. So, and this is an important part of the episode because the Beyond Data podcast doesn't have any sponsor presently except for the Angler's Pint, which is an excellent sponsor to have. And so we like to use our Angler's Pints while we are recording the episode. And Karen is actually the creator of the Angler's Pint. So Karen, why don't you tell us what an Angler's Pint is while I pour you your beer?
So, if you've ever had a pint in Britain, you might have noticed that there's a little crown etched near the top of the glass. That signifies that it's a royal pint. It's actually the law that you need to pour to that level. And it holds 20 imperial fluid ounces. In the United States, we don't have the same certification, but usually a pint is 16 ounces. So this glass is actually the Angler's Pint, and it has a pour line with the rod above the British crown and the American flag. It holds 21.5 fluid ounces, and it's perfect for tall tales after a day of fishing.
Awesome. And your Angler's Pint has a Chinook salmon on it.
It does.
And that's a special limited edition Angler's Pint. And you're actually drinking a Dale's Pale Ale from Oscar Blues Brewery. And maybe you can tell us why you're drinking that specific beer in that specific glass.
So there's a documentary that came out this year, which actually has won all kinds of awards. An independent film made by Jennifer Galvin called The Memory of Fish. And it's about salmon in the Pacific Northwest and basically a pulp mill worker's his taking on much bigger companies to try to restore the salmon fishery. And anyway, so the North Carolina premiere of this documentary, they gave Angler's Pints to all of the guests in attendance, and Oscar Blues Brewery, which I'm having, was one of the sponsors.
And so the logo for Oscar Blues is actually on the back of the glass.
That's correct.
Because we do co-brand some of these glasses. So if you have a fishing club or a wedding or some sort of advocacy organization that has to do with fishes, and you want to get in touch with Karen to ask her about maybe putting your logo or message on the back of one of her Angler's Pints, we'll give you the information both in the show notes and at the end of the episode about how to get in touch with her. So I'm drinking my beer out of a bluefin tuna Angler's Pint. This is one of the most recent Angler's Pints. We're only doing them in small numbers right now, but it's an absolutely stunning glass. It's a little different than the trout Angler's Pints that are carried by Orvis, the Orvis company that's over in Vermont, because it has a saltwater fly rod because obviously it's a bluefin tuna. And it also has a fly on the back that is a mackerel pattern that Karen has drawn. And obviously all the fish in the Angler's Pints are illustrated by Karen Talbot. And I'm enjoying today Woods and Waters, which is one of my favorite new beers in the last year from the Maine Beer Company. And it's a celebration of our fantastic new national monument that we have here in Maine, which is not terribly far away, and a place where we've spent some time recreating.
It's beautiful up there.
It is beautiful up there. Okay, so enough with the Angler's Pints and the introductions, and let's get down to answering some of your questions. Actually, first we need to say cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers. Okay, so if you didn't catch the first episode of Beyond Data, you can do that now. You can go to www.beyonddatapodcast.com, or you can go to iTunes or TuneIn or Stitcher or wherever you get your podcasts, and you'll be able to download the episode there and listen to it. Did I just say iTunes? Mm-hmm. Apple doesn't like that anymore. You're supposed to say Apple Podcasts, so my apologies to Apple. You can go to Apple Podcasts and download it. And you'll want to listen to that because a lot of what we talk about today won't make any sense unless you've heard the episode. The episode is an hour long, so make sure you have some time and you sit down and listen to it.
But it's great, and the hour goes by very quickly because it's very interesting and entertaining.
She has to say that because she's my wife. Okay, so I've got a list of questions here that came in through our Facebook page, which is facebook.com/BeyondDataPodcast. Also ones that came to us by email. We didn't get any questions from Twitter this week, but we did get some folks who called in. You can leave a message, and the telephone number is both on the Facebook page and also on beyonddatapodcast.com. So let's start with the first question, which is please don't use, well, it's not a question, it's a request. Please don't use the term trash fish. It's disrespectful and gross. So a little context there, trash fish, we talk in the episode a little bit about that trash fish is a term that's used often in the culinary context for species that are underutilized and abundant. And the idea here very quickly is that some people and organizations promote trash fish as a way to shift people's focus away from some species that may be too overutilized and overfished. And so trash fish is not a term that I came up with. It's a term that's actually used by other people. I think I mentioned that in the episode, that the more descriptive term is certainly abundant and underutilized, abundant and underutilized instead of trash fish. But trash fish has certainly worked from a marketing perspective. I think when you go to a white tablecloth restaurant where you might be paying $20 or $30 for a plate, and you're being served what the chef is calling a trash fish, there's a little bit of there's some irony there. There's it's something that's I think worked from a marketing perspective. Karen, do you?
Yes, no, I agree. I agree.
So yeah, I understand completely that yes, trash fish is disrespectful and potentially suggests it's gross. I need to go back and look at this because I tell this story all the time. This is not the first time I've heard this suggestion. I need to go back and look and actually find out when this was. I think this might have been a chef's collaborative event, which might have occurred around 2012, 2011. And I think that there was actually an event where they served the first course at this named trash fish dinner in a little plastic trash can.
Something.
Do you remember that?
Yeah, that rings a bell.
Yeah, and so it certainly has caught on since then, and there's been trash fish dinners all over the country. But yes, I agree. It is disrespectful and gross if you take it in that context, but let's put it in the context of the culinary trash fish movement. Anything else to say about that?
No, the culinary trash fish movement is not disrespectful and gross. And I also was going to say, when I worked with my students doing a residency through the Farnsworth Museum last year, we talked a lot about abundant and underutilized species, and my students actually created one of these species, a big sort of 3D model of it out of trash that they collected on the beach.
I will post a picture of that in the show notes.
It was pretty
Please
great.
remind me. It was incredibly cool. And it was professionally installed, the Farnsworth Museum, which is truly a world-class art museum that we are very fortunate to have right here in Rockland, Maine. Okay, I'm going to skip the next question because it's probably the biggest one and goes into the most depth. So let's tick off some of the other ones first. This is a great question. Don't the trawl surveys just rip up the habitat? So we talked about trawl surveys as one of the ways to look at population abundance of the oyster toadfish. And the trawl surveys actually give us some useful information, but it's not great information because they're not specifically geared towards oyster toadfish, but it's the best information we have. They are the best data we have regarding oyster toadfish abundance. So what's up with that, though? We hear a lot about trawls, and we hear a lot about dragging the bottom of the ocean with trawls and how damaging that is to habitats. So does it really make sense to do these trawls in the name of science? Karen?
Well, I'm not exactly addressing that, but I'm thinking about, I participate in the Maine Bumblebee Atlas survey, which is, it's a citizen science project looking at trying to get a handle on what is the actual bumblebee population here in Maine, so that conservation measures can be put into place, and if necessary. And one of the things that we do is we collect specimens of bumblebees and live bumblebees and kill them and pin them and send them, for research. And in the same way that, that is a useful data point for scientists to be able to use and advocate for the bumblebee. I would think that that's sort of the same thinking that goes into these trawls.
Yeah, so it's so there's a trade-off there. Yeah, you do some damage to the bottom when you trawl, but by the same token, you're getting data that you really can't get easily in another way. I think the other thing about trawl surveys, and I'll also post this in the show notes, I do have a map or a satellite photograph that DEC in New York sent to me. That's the Department of Environmental Conservation in New York, that shows, that plots where they've done their various trawl surveys in these bays where oyster toadfish are found. And the reason I bring that up is because these trawl surveys, unlike fishing activity, which might go out and trawl a relatively large area again and again and again, these scientific trawl surveys generally are trawling a much smaller area, a much more targeted area, just for the purposes of collecting data, not for the purposes of maximizing yield for selling the fish. But it's a great question. Your explanation about the Bumblebee Atlas, is that what it's called?
Yes.
That's Moby. Hi, Moby. Your explanation about the Bumblebee Atlas and killing bumblebees in the name of science. And in these trawl surveys, yes, these animals oftentimes are killed in the trawls. It reminds me also of other work that I've done. And the next question here is actually, did you feel guilty eating an endangered fish? And there's a couple things we need to unpack in that question. But it did remind me of the time when I was embedded with a scientific team in Sulawesi in Indonesia, in the Banggai Islands, and I was embedded with a scientific team that was looking at the Banggai Cardinalfish, which actually is a species which is listed now under the Endangered Species Act, and we killed many of those individual fish while we were in the field in the name of science. So science sometimes requires us to do things which might seem counterintuitive, but sometimes you need to get the data. Okay, so I said I needed to unpack that question. Did you feel guilty eating endangered fish? Now, I'm sure you've all listened to the episode at this point, and you'll remember that in the middle of the episode, I guess early middle of the episode, Chef Max Miller from the Landings Restaurant in Rockland, Maine, he cooked an oyster toadfish and we ate it. And earlier in the episode, I had said that the oyster toadfish is a species of greatest conservation need in the state of New York. It's not actually an endangered species. It's not listed under the Endangered Species Act. The species as a whole, throughout its range, is doing fine to the best of our knowledge. It's a species of least concern on the IUCN Red List. What we're concerned about is overfishing and population trends that are going down in areas where the species has been overfished, but it's a very localized situation. So it's not an endangered fish. It's not an endangered species, but it is in trouble in certain areas. The one that we ate actually came from Massachusetts, where there's no indication that there's any problem with oyster toadfish. In fact, there doesn't even appear to be much of a fishery for oyster toadfish in Massachusetts. Is that good?
Sounds good to me.
Okay. Each fillet was only an ounce. How is that even possible? And I think what this person was probably getting at here is that, how can you have a fishery for a fish that produces only an ounce or 2 ounces of meat? And Max actually addressed this a little bit in the episode. He compared it to a monkfish, which is another species where you have this giant head. What did Max say?
I think he said it's basically a giant head with a butthole.
Yes, or a mouth with a butthole, maybe.
I don't know.
Yes, something like that. But yeah, this is a fish that has a giant head and a small tail, and the tail is where the meat comes from. And so it is a species where if you count the poundage of each fish, the poundage of fish landed, that's going to be a much larger number than the actual poundage of fish fillet that's going to go to market. And so the one that we had was actually a relatively small oyster toadfish, but they don't get very big. I think from what I heard interviewing a lot of fishermen, the biggest one that any fisherman ever told me that he'd seen was approaching 5 pounds, and that's the weight of the whole fish. So those fillets certainly would have been larger than an ounce each, but not much larger. So how is that even possible? It's possible because the oyster toadfish has a very specific niche demand, and that is the live Asian food market largely. And people are willing to pay a price that justifies harvesting these fish in some cases.
And you guys just ate part of the fish. There are more parts of the fish that things could be done with.
Well, the only other part that we really talked about maybe eating was the cheeks.
The cheeks, but also you could, for stock,
Absolutely correct. Yeah, you could have. And in fact, I think Max said that at one point. He said that, if he'd had more time, that might have been really interesting to have done that. And that would have been cool. We didn't eat the cheeks because we actually, and this reminds me, I need to check with Max, we salted the head, and we're going to try to get the skull, and because Karen likes to have dead animals in her studio. Or skeletons of dead animals. The dead animals, I guess, stay in the freezer.
Well, all kinds of animals. Moby's in there with me all the time, too.
Yes, he's not dead. Okay, so that ticks off that question. What do they sound like? So I was fortunate enough to be connected with Dave Kimbro, who works at Northeastern. He's a scientist, and he's done some really interesting work with the vocalizations of oyster toadfish. And he shared with me really this quite cool thing that oyster toadfish, we know that they consume crabs, and we know that that's a key ecosystem function that oyster toadfish play, specifically on shellfish beds, because the crabs eat the juvenile shellfish, and so if you don't have enough oyster fish to eat the crabs, and the population of crabs get too large and they eat the shellfish, and that's a deadly downward spiral, as we like to say. You look like you're about to say something.
Oh, no.
Oh,
sorry.
Okay.
I was nodding and
going
along with that.
So what David said is that, yeah, sure, they eat them. The toadfish eat the crabs, but even cooler, perhaps, the toadfish actually scare the crabs. And David has done some really interesting work looking at fear and fear, the role of fear in ecosystems between species. And so oyster toadfish, by making these vocalizations, they actually scare the crabs away. So it's not only just eating them, but it's the sounds they make that prove effective.
It's very appropriate to talk about this around Halloween, isn't it?
Yes, Karen, it is.
Scary toadfish.
Cheers.
Cheers.
So Halloween. Scary toadfish.
But do you have a recording or anything of?
I do.
Oh, great.
So the recording that I'm going to play for you right now is actually it's a looped recording because it was part of David's work. But it will give you a sense of what it sounds like, and I think I actually have a link to another one as well, which I will go ahead and include probably in the show notes. So here's your recording, your looped recording of an oyster toadfish. So, pretty
wow,
cool. Yeah,
very cool.
Very
oh my
cool.
Gosh.
Yeah. Okay, so what do they sound like? All right, I didn't know there were conchs in New York. I thought they were just in Florida. So we're going to see how carefully Karen listened to the episode.
Well, they're whelks.
Oh.
I forget his name, the nice man who was talking with you, but he was calling them conchs, but you said they're whelks, actually.
Yes. You're talking about Mr. Grothy.
Yes.
And so Wayne Grothy is a fisherman, a bayman. That's what the local term for fishers is in Long Island, baymen. And they refer to them as conchs, and they refer to them as conch traps or conch pots. The thing they catch them in, the trap they catch them in. But yes, they are not conchs. They are in fact whelks. But the names are used interchangeably in New York.
The shells look similar.
Do they?
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah, I guess they do.
Not quite. I mean, the conch is more.
Right.
But yeah.
Right.
I think a lot of people pick up whelk shells and think it's a conch shell.
Kill the pig. Literary allusion.
Yes.
To what?
Cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers to Lord of the Flies.
Lord of the Flies. With the conch. Okay, so the next question is, where were the hackleheads sold, in the U.S. or Asia? So hackleheads, as we discussed in the episode, is the term or the name that's used locally for oyster toadfish in Long Island. Further south, they're called oyster crackers, or so I've been told. And so in terms of where they are sold, this is a really interesting question, and I just didn't have the time, space, or resources to really get into this as much as I would have liked. Maybe we'll come back in season 2 and look at the oyster toadfish again, because there's so much more information I had to cut to get this episode down to just an hour. One of the things we really were trying to look at is U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service records, the data from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, to see how many of these things were being exported overseas. Anecdotally, because that's what the Beyond Data podcast is about often, we have to go to things beyond the data because the data are not always all there for us or not always available for us. What I found in sort of going beyond the data and talking to people, it seems like a lot of these oyster toadfish were going to the Asian markets in Chinatown and New York, where they're sold live. But a number of them were also going overseas to Japan and other places in Asia, to the best of our knowledge. But we really have no sense of how large that export market is at this point. But that would be a really interesting thing to look at, I think.
And is there data on that? Like when things are...
Well, I'm unclear. I mean, I looked at I tried to look at some LEMIS data, and that's the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service law enforcement database. Mm-hmm. And it's difficult to know whether they would have to be... I'm unclear as to whether they would have to be listed down to the species level, or whether they would just be listed as live fish or seafood. And so I need to get in touch with Fish and Wildlife and have that conversation. But it's a good question, and it's a very good question because in all my work across many different fisheries, the rise of a middle class, particularly in China, is playing a really significant role on fisheries as the demand for seafood has gone up. And when we get to Southeast Asian countries in particular, the value of a live fish as a food fish is tremendous. It's not uncommon when I've been in places in Southeast Asia to see live fish in restaurants, and if you are, it's definitely tied up in status if you're able to have the live fish brought to your table. Much like I remember as a kid, actually, now that I think about it, lobsters. I mean, there are lobster pounds where you would go and you would choose your lobster and you see your and there was something that was, I think it was kind of a curiosity for us, but it's definitely much more tied up with status in Southeast Asia. And so...
Yeah, no, I was, two things. One, I realized I said, is there data? And I should have said, are there data? And number two, I was thinking of that dim sum restaurant in Southern California we used to go to, where they had the whole wall of live, not just fishes, but all kinds of things.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. We used to live in Southern California. For those of you who don't know, in Laguna Beach, and yes, that was the Wands, right?
Oh, our good friends,
yes,
the Wands.
So big shout out to the Wands,
yes.
especially Nick.
Yes.
Well, and you have other connections to the family, but Nick was
they're just great.
Well, I know, and I like him. And Nick's doing some cool stuff now.
I know.
Yeah. Okay, so talking about live food fish, and actually, so in this first season of the Beyond Data podcast, we're going to run through May. We've got 8 episodes planned for you. When we get further into the spring, we're still working on even some of those, the concepts for some of those shows. And we might be looking at the live food fish trade because it is really interesting and it's pretty data deficient. Places I've been in Indonesia, for example, live groupers, they actually, some of these fishers will target these spawning aggregation of groupers, and they'll actually use cyanide in many cases to stun them and then ship them live to Hong Kong and other places. And it's really I try not to be pejorative. It's an interesting topic, but it's something we really need to look at a lot more. So maybe we'll get to that in the spring. If not, we'll put it on the list for season 2.
I would be interested to listen to that.
Okay, so the next question is, what is a swipe card? So I mentioned swipe cards in the Oyster Toadfish episode, and I mentioned them in relation to the Elver fishery here in Maine. Those are the baby eels. And the reason I mentioned them was because I said that I'm not sure exactly how I phrased it, but the Elver fishery in Maine really was kind of like the Wild Wild West, with a lot of legal activity, a lot of shady activity, some pretty serious concerns about how the fishery was being managed prior to the swipe card system. And then they implemented a swipe card system, and things got a lot better. And now Maine has implemented a swipe card system for the urchin fishery, which is definitely a topic which we'll be addressing this season, in season 1 of the Beyond Data podcast. And so what is a swipe card? Well, a swipe card is just what it sounds like. It's kind of like a credit card. It's got a little magnetic strip on the back. The magnetic strip has all the information of the person who is harvesting the eels. And so when they harvest the eels and then go to sell them to the buyer, which is often a middleman, they actually swipe the swipe card, and all the information regarding the catch, the poundage, the people's names, the value is all recorded in real time. And so, we're getting closer and closer to real time data in the fishery, and that allows us to be able to really begin to look at adaptive management, where you can manage a fishery based on real-time information, and that's a real win-win. I mean, a lot of people might, or not, people might say, well, that's awfully onerous for the fisherman to have to, for the fisher to have to get a swipe card and go through all this additional sort of bureaucracy and red tape. But in reality, if the fishery managers have confidence that the data which they are looking at is real and in real time, they feel like they can manage the fishery and make changes in response to what's going on in real time in the fishery, and therefore they don't have to be potentially quite as conservative as they might otherwise be with the fishery, that they're not going to really be able to analyze what happened in a given year until a year or 2 years later. So does that help to explain a swipe card?
I think so. Yeah.
It's pretty cool. So, and actually, the swipe card system, at least in Maine with the Elver fishery, and I assume it's the case elsewhere, was actually the support for getting the swipe card system into place was through, at least in part, ACCSP, which we talked about in the episode as well. So that's a pretty cool thing. Okay, let's see. How can you harvest tons of fish and not make it go extinct? That's a good question.
It is a good question.
Yes.
It goes back to the definition of sustainability. It
does, yeah. I actually, unfortunately, there's a little bit of audio that I'd recorded that I actually cut for the final episode where I went into this in a little bit more detail. And so we talk about, and I'm flipping through some papers here, looking at some of the scant data that we do have. But we talked about in the New York fishery, the New York Oyster Toadfish fishery, we have this incredible spike in landings in 1993. It goes from 5.9 metric tons landed in 1992 to 15.9 metric tons in 93 to 19.3 metric tons in 94. So pretty dramatic spike in the fishery. And what I had said in the audio clip that I cut was that, wow, 19.3 metric tons, that sounds like a lot of fish. And it is a lot of fish in terms of the oyster toadfish fishery in New York, and I think that case is made in the episode. But overall, 19.3 tons, metric tons, is not an obscene amount of fish when we look at fisheries overall. We look at metric tons of fishes landed. And I think one of the reason that I brought that up in the audio that I eventually cut was because I said that oftentimes advocacy groups, which, and I don't mean to put this in pejorative terms, but advocacy groups will oftentimes latch on to something like 15.9 metric tons, and they'll focus on the metric tons because the person who's not familiar with the fishery hears metric tons and thinks, oh my gosh, that's like an obscene amount of fish. Whereas it may or may not be, depending upon the context. And so it's important to always put these things into context. So some species can certainly be harvested in the tens of metric tons and still be a quote-unquote sustainable fishery in terms of maximum sustainable yield, or even in terms of an ecosystem-based approach to sustainable fisheries.
Yeah, I'm actually reminded of the Maine Bumblebee Atlas project again when some people ask questions about if potentially bumblebees are in real trouble, isn't that a bad thing that we're then basically collecting them? And I remember one of the scientists said that the reproductive capacity of insects is so great that if the 15 people in this room are going out and collecting information and collecting specimens in this way, we can't touch it.
Right. And we don't actually have this as a specific question here, but I know that in talking to some people who listened to the episode, people sort of wanted to talk about that same sort of point in regard to oyster toadfish, and how much is too much to collect of oyster, or to harvest of oyster toadfish. And I think the thing that's important to understand is that in order to manage any of these species, you need to understand the life history. And the life history and the biology of an oyster toadfish, it's a fish that lays eggs in a nest, guards the eggs, and then those young probably don't wander too far from where they were actually born. So unlike most saltwater fish, which are these pelagic broadcast spawners, where the larvae are sucked up into currents, and the juvenile fish may settle many miles away. The oyster toadfish doesn't have that ability to sort of spread its population. So if you overfish a bay to the point where there are very few reproductive adults left, it's going to take a very long time for those few adults to be able to repopulate that bay.
Yeah, and did you actually address in the episode? I know I was wondering about when the oyster toadfish reaches maturity as far as being able to reproduce.
Yeah, so the oyster. So this episode obviously focuses on the New York fishery for the oyster toadfish, and it turns out that most of the science that's been done on oyster toadfish has been done on populations further to the south. So
That makes a difference.
so the life history may be different, and there isn't any really good science of which I'm aware, or which John at DEC of which he was aware, that would really let us know, this is when the New York population of oyster toadfish reaches sexual maturity.
Right.
DEC did put in place in 2006 the regulations where they said you can't take an oyster toadfish in either the recreational or the commercial fishery that's less than 10 inches in length. Mm-hmm. The thinking there being that by the time they reach that size, they've at least had a chance to reproduce for a year. And I can't remember if I included what John had told me in the episode, but he did tell me that in his thinking, he thinks that it's probably more like they've had a chance to reproduce 4 years by the time, by the time they're able to be legally harvested.
And he also talked about the fluctuation in numbers of young of year for the species, and
right.
how that can change.
Right. Okay, so we've got 3 questions left. 2 of them are, do you think people are getting bored?
No.
You don't think so?
I'm not bored.
Okay, good. Well, that's because you're drinking beer.
No.
Okay. All right, so we've got 3 questions left. One of them's a biggie, and the other 2 are, one's really easy. So we'll save that one for last. And then, so we'll get into the one that's not the real biggie first, and then we'll get into the biggie, and then we'll wrap it up.
Yep.
Sound good?
Sounds good.
Okay. So the question is, why did you choose the oyster toadfish? Which is a great question, because it is a fish that most people seem to not be aware of unless they are anglers and have caught them, or commercial fishermen and found them in their traps. Mm-hmm. But it's not a bluefin tuna. It's not a Chinook salmon. I'm looking at our angler's pints here.
Not so sexy.
Not so sexy. That's pretty pejorative.
Oh, well.
I mean,
okay.
It's sexy, and I bet
Okay.
Mrs. Oyster Toadfish finds Mr. Oyster Toadfish kind of sexy.
Apparently.
Yeah. And because they use those vocalizations.
I know. She's lured in.
Yeah. He makes the nest and lures her in with them. Yeah.
Okay, so why did you choose the oyster toadfish?
So a couple years ago, and I'll try to dig up this article and link it in the show notes. A couple years ago, I was doing an article for the fish site, and the article was on abundant and underutilized and often data deficient species, or seafood species. And what I was really looking at was, I think there had just been an article in one of the major cooking magazines which had been really pushing underutilized and abundant so-called trash fish species, and some of the species they were pushing were great for environmental reasons, but maybe not so great for some other reasons. And so, I was trying to point out in this article that we need to really understand that when we push a species, we need to acknowledge whether or not we have enough data to manage that species or to market that species. And so in the course of doing that article, I was looking for examples of fisheries where a species that had been abundant and underutilized all of a sudden became a market developed and they became overfished. And in the course of my research, I came across the oyster toadfish. That put me in touch with a great guy named Jake Kreitzer. Jake works for the Environmental Defense Fund, and he had done some work with oyster toadfish. And we sort of went back and forth a little bit. I think the oyster toadfish only got mentioned in passing in the article, but when I began thinking about the Beyond Data podcast and was thinking about data deficient fisheries, the oyster toadfish is one that I always sort of wanted to go back to, and so it provided the opportunity. And I called up Jake, and he gave me a big refresher, and we did the episode.
And it's a really interesting story.
It is, and I think I subtitled the episode a cautionary tale, and I think it is. It's and that's the question I sort of asked at the end, like, could this happen again? Could a species that was considered to be abundant in the case of the oyster toadfish, so abundant that people were intentionally killing it just because it was a nuisance, not to eat it. Could a market develop, and then all of a sudden, like the case of oyster toadfish, we have landings increased by over 300% in a year, and in 2 to 3 years, the fishery completely collapses. Right. And fisheries managers never really even had enough time to see that was happening, much less do anything about it. It wasn't until 2006 that regulations were put in place, so more than a decade after the fishery collapsed. And so I asked the question, could that happen again? And that brings us to the big question. So the big question is, you said the neighboring states didn't regulate the species. Is the toadfish being overfished in those states? And that's a great question. And I did begin to go down that road in my research, and pretty quickly realized that it was much too large a question to address in the first episode, or in an hour-long episode. But I can share with you some of my thoughts about that now, and some of the data that are available. The short answer to the question is it not only could happen again, but it actually may have happened again with the oyster toadfish. So if we just look at the East Coast and we look at where the oyster toadfish where there's a fishery for the oyster toadfish, we see in Delaware, Virginia, and North Carolina, we see pretty significant spikes in oyster toadfish landings in those states. Mm-hmm. And then we see pretty precipitous falls in terms of landings following the initial spike in landings. And in most of those states, and not all of those states have responded to my inquiries, but in the ones that have, it appears as if the oyster toadfish is not regulated in those states. So it's an unregulated species, and it's a species where we have these pretty significant fluctuations. So to give you a sense, you were going to say something?
No.
Why I dig up this?
Yeah, I was just going to say we're looking at this line graph and the spikes, and then the quick decline, and the number of the is this poundage or
those are pounds.
Yeah, pounds of oyster toadfish landed. They all sort of have that same. I mean, it's a high peak and then a very low valley.
So I'm going to put this. This graph in the show notes, so you can take a look at it if you want to. There's actually 2 different graphs for you to look at. The important thing to understand here is that the oyster toadfish fishery in all these states is a data deficient fishery. The data that I'm using here are data from the National Marine Fisheries Service, commercial landings data. We know that if you listen to the episode, you heard people talk about that that the reported landings are probably significantly less than the actual landings. And then we have a bunch of years where there are just no landings data reported at all. And in some cases, those might be years where the data just didn't make it through to the end result, to the data set, to the database. But they also might be years when the rule of three necessitated those data becoming confidential. And if you want to know more about the rule of three, you heard about that in the episode. But to give you a sense of what we're talking about, certainly the New York fishery is probably the most dramatic, going from 5.9 metric tons in 92 to 15.9 metric tons in 93 to 19.3 metric tons in 94, and then crashing down to 0.9 and then 0.1 in 96, 97, 98. If we look though at the Delaware fishery, we see a spike in 2008 and 2009, where the fishery goes from 1.6 metric tons in 2007 to 13.2 metric tons in 2008, and then to 10.2 metric tons in 2009, and then drops all the way back to 2 metric tons in 10, 1.1 metric tons in 11, 0.1 metric tons in 12, and 0.0 metric tons, 110 pounds landed in 2013. So that seems to fit that pattern of, relatively low landings, and all of a sudden we jump from 3,500 pounds to 29,000 pounds in a year. We also see a spike if we look at Virginia, and Virginia is one I'm actually really interested to look into in a little more depth. We do see a spike in 1995, and I wonder if that spike has any relation to the New York fishery all of a sudden sort of dropping off. The New York fishery appears to have collapsed in 1995, and we see Virginia go from, we don't have any data for Virginia prior to 1995 except for 1 year, and that's 1983 when 200 pounds were landed. But in 1995, 23,768 pounds, 10.8 metric tons were landed in Virginia. The following year in 96, it goes to 56 pounds. 0.0 metric tons. And then we see it stay pretty low until 2007 when it jumps to 1.7 metric tons, and then it kind of takes a break in 2008, 2009. Then in 2010 it goes to 4.2 metric tons, and then it stays relatively high for 12, 13, 14, 15. So I wonder what that fishery is looking like. I mean, in 15, which is the most recent year of data available through National Marine Fisheries Service, they landed 6,161 pounds.
And at that same time, I mean, I hope that listeners will be able to look at the graph if they're interested, but the North Carolina fishery is going through the roof.
Yeah, the North Carolina fishery is a fascinating one. The North Carolina fishery, I definitely want to learn a lot more about that fishery. We see a dramatic spike that mirrors very closely the New York fishery. In 1990 through all the way through the early 2000s, we've got 0.0, 0.1, 0.5, 0.2, 0.5, 0.1, 0.0 metric tons landed, and then all of a sudden we get to 2011. We go from 1.7 metric tons in 2010 to 17.6 metric tons in 2011. So not quite as high as New York's peak, but almost. And then in 2012. 15.2 metric tons, and then it falls off by the time we get to 2013 to 6.6 metric tons. So we definitely see a spike there. Now, I will also link this article in the show notes because we don't have time to read it now, but it's interesting that in 2011, so that's the year that the North Carolina toadfish fishery takes off and goes from 1.7 metric tons to 17.6 metric tons, I found an article in the, What is this publication called? It is called... Do I have it? I don't have it. Oh, no.
Oh, honey.
Oh, no. So I can't cite it. I'll cite it in the show notes. It's an Outer Banks publication, North Carolina Outer Banks newspaper. And the article is titled, O'Neill's Sea Harvest Finds New Market for Delicacy. And this is not far from Manteo, in the village of Wanchese.
Yeah.
It's called Wanchese.
I know where
Is that
that
the
is.
proper
Yeah.
pronunciation? Karen spent a lot of time in the Outer Banks with her family.
Yeah.
North Carolina.
They're there right now.
They're there right now. And in this article, which is in 2011, which is the year that there's a spike, O'Neill's Sea... Whoa, Moby just took my microphone off. Hang on a sec. Technical difficulties.
Oh, boy.
Hang on, Mopes.
Moby hasn't even had any beer.
No, he hasn't. Moby likes beer.
He does.
Okay. So in 2011, which is the year we see the spike in the North Carolina fishery, this article comes out. O'Neill's Sea Harvest finds new market for delicacy, and guess what the delicacy is? Oyster toadfish. And I'll just read a small portion of the article. The list now includes oyster toadfish. List what they're selling. The fish, which grows up to about a foot long, looks like a monkfish and is prized for its tail meat, which has been compared with lobster tail for flavor. And Max compared it with...
He sure did.
With lobster.
Yep.
Quote, when we bring in the crabs from our crab pots, we'd find some oyster toads in with the crabs, explained O'Neill. Sounds very similar to what we heard in New York. Quote, we didn't have any use for them until we found out there was a large market. This is our first year selling them. So that was 2011, and that's when it seems to have exploded. And then he says later in the article, we just had one truckload leave for Chicago, but most of them go to New York. From there, many of the fish are shipped to Japan. They are popular in sushi bars where diners pick them live out of a tank, then watch as the tail meat is prepared and served raw. They are also now available at Sea Harvest Fish Market and the restaurant, where seafood lovers can buy them to go or eat them on the front deck. So that's interesting. That and I don't know if there was a lot of other people. I do know from talking to the Department of Environmental and Natural Resources in North Carolina that almost all the oyster toadfishes landed in the state come from Dare County.
Really?
So come from that one area.
Yeah.
So I'd be very interested to look at trawl surveys. Now I do know that I did, because this spike did look so much to me like the spike we saw in New York, I did push for a little bit more information from North Carolina, and I spoke with a biologist there by the name of Trish. I'm trying to remember what Trish's last name is, but Trish was very helpful. And she sent me a bunch of data, and we talked about it quite a bit. She said that she did check with their trip ticket program to see if we recorded oyster toadfish landings, and we do. And then she tells me that they were mostly taken in crab pots. And she says that the landings were generally low until 2011 and 2012. She tells me the majority of the landings come from Dare County.
Which is the Outer Banks.
Which is the Outer Banks. And then most are being sold live, and most are going to the Northeast. She says there does not appear to be any oyster toad landings elsewhere in the state. And then later, I sort of asked her about regulation. She said no, they're not regulated either recreationally or commercially in North Carolina. So as long as you are adhering to the regulations consistent with the gear you're using, whether it's a pot fishery, you can land as many oyster toadfish as you want. I don't think North Carolina has a default bag limit like Florida does. So you can land as many as you want. And she also told me, I did ask her about if they'd been looking at population trends because, again, it mirrors so closely what happened in New York. I would think that if they were fishing them from that one small area, they could fish them out pretty quickly. And she said that no, as far as localized overfishing concerns, I am not aware of any concerns at this time.
Wow.
So, but they are not doing any targeted trawl surveys or population abundance surveys for the species, to the best of my knowledge. So that's pretty interesting. So yeah, so in the neighboring states, the ones that I've spoken to, I have yet to find a neighboring state where there are regulations in place for oyster toadfish. The data that we do have are mostly National Marine Fisheries Service data, and they're kind of all over the place. But we definitely can pull at least 4 definite spikes in Atlantic fisheries, oyster toadfish fisheries. So I think it's a topic that definitely deserves additional attention. Anything to say about that?
I was just thinking the Dare County area in North Carolina is also known for being sort of a fragile area, and I wonder, in this year of hurricanes and sort of more extreme weather, how the oyster toadfish are faring.
Yeah, they're very dependent upon habitat. So they need the, so if they, they're the places where they, well, the other thing about oyster toadfish though is that they're incredibly robust. Like, they do incredibly well in trash. They live in oyster, they live in tires and.
Right, and Max was still seeing, well, that doesn't have to do anything with it, but.
Yes.
Yes. It took a really long time to.
It took a really long time for the fish to kind of, well, it was
not die,
dead, but there was still a lot of nerve activity.
Yes.
But yes, they're very difficult to kill. In fact, several people told me in the course of my interviews that you could actually just throw wet seaweed on top of them and ship them, and they'd arrive alive. Which is pretty dramatic. Okay, last question, super simple one. When will the next episode come out? The plan right now is that the next episode will come out around the middle to the 3rd week in November. So we're on a schedule for once a month between now and May, so 8 episodes in this first season. And I'm not ready to reveal quite yet what the next episode will be, because I'm still doing research into several episodes that could all be the next episode. But I think I have a pretty good sense of where we're headed now. You're smiling.
It's very exciting.
Yes, it's very exciting. Very exciting. So looking forward to bringing you more stories in the Beyond Data podcast. I hope that you will subscribe on iTunes or Apple Podcasts. Or Stitcher or TuneIn or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also always go to beyonddatapodcast.com. Please do like our Facebook page. I will post some of these graphs and so forth and other resources I've mentioned today on the Facebook page, but I'll also post them in the show notes. So make sure you go there. What else do we need to say?
You should order your Angler's Pint so you have it ready when you listen to the next episode.
You should definitely order your Angler's Pints. Yes, this is true.
Our show sponsor.
Our show sponsor, yes. So today, again, we were drinking out of the Chinook Angler's Pint and the Bluefin Tuna Angler's Pint. There are also 4 trout. What are they?
That's correct. There's the Colorado cutthroat trout. There is the brown trout. There's the rainbow trout, and then there is the brook trout. All
of them are perfect for
tall tales after a day on the water.
All right, so this has been the Beyond Data podcast. I'm Rhett.
I'm Karen.
And thank you very much for listening. I hope we didn't bore you too much. And we look forward to seeing you soon.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye. Thanks to my guest today, Karen Talbot, and to the Angler's Pint. You can get yours at anglerspint.com. Music by Andy Cohen. If you'd like to ask a question or make a comment about today's show, email me at rhett@rhetttalbot.com. Leave a voicemail at 207-370-1575. Send a tweet to @rhetttalbot or comment on the show's Facebook page, which is facebook.com/beyonddatapodcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider subscribing on Apple Podcasts, where you can also rate the podcast and post a review. That really does make a difference.